Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. George McLaughlin, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. Like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. So with your permission, we're going to start with where you were born, go all the way up to today, and then we want to talk about kind of the amazing things you're doing with Vicious Biscuit. And full disclosure, I'm completely addicted to your Vicious Benny. So just so you know, I'm an absolute addict, right? And I can't wait to go back and have some more. So thanks for being here, man.
Well, hey, thanks for having us.
So we're going to start with where you were born, go all the way up to today. And I want to talk also about some of the amazing things you're doing to give back. And some of the things that you've done in your past, obviously, with in business. So where were you born?
So I was born in Laurel, Mississippi.
Okay.
My family's not originally from there. My father was recruited down there from actually Nashville, Tennessee, but my family's originally from Jacksonville, Florida, but have lived all over. And so I'm the youngest of three, and I was fortunate to be born in Laurel, Mississippi, of all places.
There you go. Did you grow up in Mississippi?
Yeah, I did. I was the youngest of three, like I said earlier, and we all went off to school. I actually went back to Jacksonville, Florida, to the Bowl School to swim. All three of us were raised swimmers. My mother was a competitor swimmer, so I was in Jacksonville, Florida, when my parents first met, and lived the majority of their lives. So yeah,
that's
great
cool.
place.
That's cool. So growing up in Laurel, what was your favorite thing about that?
I love the small town. It was great that you could ride your bike down the street. All your friends live close, and you could still hear, your mother ring the dinner bell. And you had to be home before that bell stopped ringing, and you were in trouble.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. I remember those days.
Yeah, it's a great town that's got a lot of notoriety recently because of a show called This Hometown.
Yeah.
So Laurel's now become a popular place again.
Yeah, that's awesome. My wife watches that show. I wondered why I heard why Laurel sounded familiar. Yeah, it's actually become notoriety, a lot of notoriety now.
Right. Yes, my brother
a ton of stuff there.
So my brother bought my father's company and still lives in Laurel, Mississippi. So I get the pleasure of going back and visiting it. It's a great small town.
That's cool. That's cool. So where'd you go to high school?
I went to the Bowl School.
Okay.
In Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a student there.
Gotcha. So in high school in Jacksonville, did you have a favorite subject?
Math was always my favorite, but also loved science.
Yeah.
So, but mostly math. It just came easy to me. English was, funny enough, English was a challenge because my mother was an English professor. So that side of that family went to my sister. Brother and I had the math side of the family.
You didn't quite get that gene, huh?
Yeah, I mean, believe me, she beat it into us, so I'm actually pretty good at it, but it was not my favorite subject, to say the least.
She beat it into you. That's good for you. So we know what your favorite subject or favorite sport was, right, in high school. So did you have a favorite teacher?
I did. Mr. Engel was our science teacher. Probably one of the funniest guys ever. If you weren't paying attention in his class, he would grab the eraser and throw it at you. And he also would, if you acted up, he would leave all his coffee cups on a shelf after every day. And then 2 to 3 weeks later, after they really grew enough bacteria, if you got in trouble, you had to clean them.
Oh, yeah.
So Mr. Engel, and then Mr. Bailey, who's my history teacher. And then, had some great teachers back in the day. That was a long time ago. So.
Yeah. I got you. Going back a bit. So growing up, who was the most influential person to you?
Wow, that's, I would say, you could argue to say it was my brother and my father. Very good leaders. My brother was a heck of an athlete. He was 5 years older than I was, so he was kind of my role model.
Yeah.
And then my father, he was, in business. I used to go to the factory with him on Saturdays and ride my bike around while he worked on Saturdays. He seemed never to stop working. So, but he taught me a lot. He taught me a lot about business and gave me some great pointers on things to read. He was actually the reason why I ended up at Ole Miss.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I thought I was going to go to, possibly University of Florida. And he said to me, he said, look, your brother and sister have gone all over the place. The best education you can get is at Ole Miss. And he said, I want you to come over and look at it before you make a decision. And I did. And that's how I ended up in Oxford, Mississippi.
Wow. That's awesome. What a great school to go to.
I love it. Fortunate enough, my daughter goes there now.
Yeah.
So I get to, my wife is actually coming back from it right now. She went to the Oklahoma game. She's a South Carolina fan.
Yeah.
So it's good.
And I'm an Oklahoma Sooner fan.
Oh boy, sorry
Y'all
about that.
whooped up all over us.
Yeah, that was a sloppy game, but win's a win right now in the SEC.
Isn't that the truth? So I was literally playing golf last Thursday, and there was a gentleman in our foursome I'd never met before, had a South Carolina cap on.
Right.
And I told the story that you told me about your daughter going to South Carolina and then walking on the beach with you and telling you, tell that story.
Yeah. So when we opened Vicious in 2018, it was actually December 22nd. The night before, I told my daughter, I was like, look, we've had to throw this together. We got to get it open. And you got to go to work with me tomorrow morning. She said, Dad, I've never worked in the restaurant business. And I said, well, it's been 10 years since I've done it. So we'll fake it until we make it. So the next morning we were there, and then I swear it was 2 weeks into it, she was practically running the restaurant. And I'll never forget her looking at me and saying, in the 15 years I've been on the earth, I never thought I would ever work with my father. Yeah. And so it was quite interesting. And so, that was also the time when we kind of rolled into COVID in 2020.
Yeah.
A little over a year and a half later. And she was a senior in high school, was at the Wando School, was graduating with a lab coat, was all focused on going into nursing, was planned out that she was going to South Carolina where my wife went to school. And then one day she says, Dad, I want to do what you do. I want to create opportunities for people. And I don't know if I'm going to get that in the nursing. I was like, well, you can save lives or you can make biscuits. So you get to choose. So I would say it was about a month or two later. It was probably the end of March. She came in. We get out at 3:30. The restaurant. We were home, and she sat down with me and she said, "Dad, I've made my decision. I want to go to Ole Miss." And I was like, "Ole Miss?" I was like, "Ole Miss was never, ever in your never thought you would go there." It was always
on the radar. Yeah.
It was my son, who was 2 years younger, who was, he played football, and he was like, always said since he was 6 years old, he was going to be the quarterback at Ole Miss. And sure enough, she just told me, she says, I want to go to Ole Miss and do what you do. I want to go into business.
Wow.
So, at that moment, I was sad and happy all at the same time, because one, I could go back to my alma mater. And then number two, I was sad because she was going to be 652 miles away.
Yeah.
But 2 weeks later, we flew over. Went through the orientation, and I was like, wow, I couldn't be more happy for her to be back, to be in Oxford, such a great town, unbelievable university.
That's really cool, man. What a great story. I love that. That's got to be one of my favorite stories. So let's go back for just a second. So you graduate from high school, you go to Ole Miss. What do you study at Ole Miss?
So I was a business major. I was emphasis of going into business law. My father wanted to know if I was going to be the youngest of three to come back and, so-called take over the family business. He was in walk-in cooler manufacturing. And sure enough, the end of my sophomore year, I wanted to stay in Oxford. I got my first restaurant job my freshman year in high school. I went back to Jacksonville and worked at the Ortega Yacht Club and met some of the most interesting people ever. And I loved the whole vibe of the restaurant business and being able to get to know your customer. And so my sophomore year, I wanted to stay in Oxford. I was hell-bent on graduating in 4 years. So I was making sure if I needed to take that one elective to make sure I graduated in 4 years, I did that summer. But I got a job at a place called Checkers at the time. It was one of the hardest places to get a job. It wasn't the hamburger place. It was actually the deli that Dr. Newcomb and Chris Newcomb and Neil Newcomb had started in Oxford. They started in an old movie set where they filmed the movie Heart of Dixie in 1989. So they opened up shortly after that. Dr. Newcomb wanted to create a sandwich / custard shop. He collaborated with another individual. Neil had been coming back over from SMU, and so that's where they kind of formed Checkers as a deli. And then when they opened a location down in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, they knew they needed to change the name because there was a Checkers hamburger.
Right.
So Checkers spelled differently. It was a kind of I wouldn't say a French spelling, but pretty close to it. And so that's where they came up with the name McAlister's Deli. It was a family name. So, you take a Scottish name with a Jewish theme and make it a Southern deli. Makes a lot of sense.
There you go.
So I started working there, fell in love with it. I was in a fraternity, and I went to my fraternity brothers. And I said, look, I've fallen in love with this business. I'm going to work full time while going to school full time. And so I worked through my junior and senior year. Never forget Dr. Newcomb coming in during one of the football games my senior year, and he said, we're going to really consider franchising this. And I knew he was thinking about it, because when we'd have football games, people would wait in line for 2 hours to get a sandwich. And I'm like, why are you waiting 2 hours to get a sandwich? But the food was exceptional at McAlister's. And so fell in love with the business. And then, I told Dr. Newcomb, I said, look, if you ever think about franchising this, I'm in. I'm ready to go. So in May of 95, I graduated from Ole Miss. Dr. Newcomb offered me a job to move down to Jackson, Mississippi, where we were opening our 4th location. That was going to be kind of our franchise corporate headquarters, training facility. And so I packed up my stuff, moved down to Jackson, started June 1st. Never forget my mother calling me. She's like, all right, now what are you doing? Are you, ready for business school? Are you doing LSAT? What's going to happen? And I said, well, Mom, I've taken a job. I just moved to Jackson, Mississippi, and I'm working in McAlister's Deli. And she said, son, what are you thinking? No one makes money in the restaurant business. I was like, well, I think you've forgotten that the people I used to know in Jacksonville did very well in the restaurant business. So I'm going to give this a shot. I love it. I didn't want to be in an office. I actually interned for a law firm for my father my end of my senior year in high school. I was in Reading, Pennsylvania for 2 weeks doing depositions. And that quickly gave me the insight that being a lawyer just wasn't all what you see on TV.
This is boring. Yeah. This is really, all we're doing is sitting around. Come on, man.
They were very painful. So, I wanted to do business. And so I graduated, in business administration and jumped headfirst into helping the Newcomb start the franchise division. It was quite the learning curve. I mean, if there was ever getting your MBA in franchising, you jump into it head first, not knowing what you're doing. A lot of the do's and don'ts. We made a lot of mistakes, but after some time, we figured it out. And so it was a great learning lesson. And then from there, a year and a half later, while in 96, I came to Dr. Newcomb and I said, listen, you sold the state of Florida out from underneath me. That's where I wanted to go back. I wanted to do Jacksonville, Gainesville, Tallahassee. We started in college town. I wanted to go back to a college town. And so first thing, I was like, I'm going to go to Gainesville, Tallahassee, and then end up in Jacksonville, because my mother had just moved to Jacksonville. And so I was like, what better way to get back on the East Coast? And so he sold Florida. And then one day, I was probably just up to here with all the craziness of working 80 hours a week, traveling all over, fixing franchisees that Dr. Newcomb had sold to, and trying to show them how to, start a business, run a business. And I finally looked at him. I said, man, it's time. I said, you sold everything out but South Carolina. That's where I want to go. He says, do you know anything about South Carolina? I said, nope. Supposedly my family came over on the boat there. That's all I know about it. I've driven through it when I was very young, don't remember it, but I want to go to Columbia, South Carolina. That's where University of South Carolina had just joined the SEC, I think in like 93 or something like that.
Yeah.
So I just said, sight unseen, I'm doing it. And I was thinking, well, Dr. Newcomb would say, okay, well, in a year or two, when you're ready, we'll award that to you. He was like, all right, let's do it. And I was like, okay. So I literally packed up. I actually called up my father. I said, Dad, you won't believe this, but I'm about to be a franchisee in McAlister's Deli. And I saved up this money to buy the first right to Columbia, because he only would sell me one. Yeah. And so I literally bought a plane ticket, flew over on a Sunday morning, got in touch with a real estate agent through a connection through Jackson, Mississippi, landed in Columbia on Sunday morning, The Columbia airport was under construction. So right when you got out of a plane, you walked out on the tarmac and you walked through a wooden tunnel
Yeah.
for like half a mile till you got to the other side of it. Got into my rental car, which was amazing. I could rent a car at 22 years of age at the time, and drove out. First restaurant I saw in Columbia was a place called Lizard's Thicket. And I was like, oh
Ooh.
God, what have I done?
Yeah.
And drove into downtown Columbia, and I was looking around. I was like, this is not an SEC school. There's tall buildings here. What's going on here? And I
Yeah.
was used to the small college towns. Granted, you have Knoxville and you get Gainesville, but Columbia was, the university is stuck right in the middle of the town.
Yeah.
And so I pulled right up on the campus, and I was on Main Street, 2 blocks down. There was not a soul on the road. I mean, it was the craziest thing I've ever seen. And my real estate agent, Houston Fitzpatrick was his name. He walks out on the street 2 blocks away, calls out my name. I was like, Houston, walked down the middle of the street, shook his hand. I said, well, I own the rights. Let's go do this.
Mm-hmm.
So we drove around for 2 days, finally found a location, flew back home, packed up my truck that I had at the time, and drove back 2 days later, stayed in a hotel for a month and a half until I found the location. And from there, the rest is history, I guess.
So what made the location work? What was the thing that sort of stuck out to you?
So I stayed in a hotel for a month and a half.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget it because, granted, you had cell phones, but you still communicated on landlines.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is I would go out every day, have lunch, go back, have dinner. I'd sit up at the bar, and I would talk to the bartender. I'm like, what's your customers like? What area do you like? Because there was 4 major areas of Columbia. I mean, you had Lexington, which was a new area. Of course, you had downtown, Forest Acres. You had Spring Valley, and you had this area they called it Harbison, but it was Irmo was the town.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I had the hotel, because that's the first location I saw, which was a piece of dirt. It was 1 acre, but I didn't know how I was going to do it. I mean, I was 22, about to be 23 years old. And I was like, I don't have the money for that.
Right.
So I needed to find an investor.
Yeah.
So really worked with my father, collaborated with him. He says, look, go find an investor, see if you can do your first location. He goes, you got to get out of the ground. It doesn't matter what it costs you, because he kept saying to me, he goes, what do you want to own? Do you want to own, all of a trickle or part of a gusher? And I said, Dad, I want that part of the gusher. I said, I want to grow this thing up. I want to be a big franchisee. And so sure enough, I had construction plans of the Tuscaloosa, Alabama location. I had my menus, I had my business plan, I had some P&Ls, and Houston introduced me to investors. And so I'll never forget the first investor I walked into. He was a huge developer. He had a very dark office. I can still see it to this day. It was all dark brown leather. It looked like something out of a mob movie.
Yeah.
And I walked down, I sit down with him. It was the middle of the day. And I put the plans on his desk. I put the thing, I said, Mr. Stern, I'd like for you to ask for you to build my first restaurant. I ran a deli in Jackson, Mississippi. It was our 4th location. I was the most highest performing general manager, and I trained all these franchisees. And this is what I would ask you to do. Build me a 3,600 square foot building, and I can be able to sell enough sandwiches to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And he literally looked at me and he said, son, how old are you, and what medication are you taking right this month? So it was like my first big rejection. And I was like, wow, so is this like a hard no? And so I went around. Houston introduced me to some others, and I got very close to cutting a deal with an investor, and he was going to build a building. So, like I said, my father's a very intelligent man. So I was running these deals by him, and I was like, here's what I got. And so every day that I would drive around, try to figure out, I had my eye on this Harbison location. Harbison was a main road, and it was right behind the mall. And I could see that they were going to build a new interchange and change the flow of traffic. And I'll never forget, Dr. Newcomb flew over, saw the location. He said, George, why do you want this site? I said, it's just like our 4th location. It's on the backside of the mall where they changed the traffic. He was probably on that site for 30 minutes. He goes, all right, I get it. Go for it. And I was like, well, got to figure out how I'm going to pay for it. So literally every day when I was talking about the cell phone and the landline, so I was talking to these investors, I would come back to my hotel room, I'd walk in, all the people at the front desk knew who I was. I was like the norm of Cheers. You'd walk in, like, George. I'd be like, any messages? Nope, not today. I was like, darn it. And so I just kept plugging away, kept talking to people, trying to, find that investor. And sure enough, I found that first investor to build a building, and I presented it to my dad, and I said, look, I mean, it's the only deal I got. Let's do it. And at that time, he had a successful company, and he said, look, you know what? We're going to build this first building for you. We need the tax write-off, but here's the deal. We'll just take it 2% less than what that investor's going to do. And I was like, and man, I must have belabored that for days. I was like, I did not go in the family business. My brother was already in the family business. I was not going to follow him into it. We were just too competitive growing up. And so finally I said, you know what? I drove back to Laurel, Mississippi, sat down with my dad, and I said, okay, look, if I do this deal, at some point, can I buy you out? I was like, we don't need to combine the businesses. And so therefore, I was fortunate enough. He structured the deal. We went out, able to get the debt, build the building. And 6 months, we opened October 11th, 1997. And within 6 months, we were the top franchisee.
Wow.
And sales. And I'll never forget, I called up Patrick Walls, who was our franchise attorney. He was the guy I trained, and then I was his first franchise he actually sold.
Right.
And so I said, Patrick, I really want to develop South Carolina, and what will it take? He goes, we're starting to get a lot of interest in South Carolina. I was like, hold the phone. I said, Dr. Newcomb already sold Florida out from underneath me. He's not going to sell South Carolina for me.
Right.
So I drove back to Jackson, Mississippi, sat down with Patrick Walls and Dr. Newcomb, and I said, listen, here's what I've mapped out in South Carolina. I think I can put 17 locations in South Carolina. And Patrick looks at the map and he goes, well, according to our data, you can put 27. And I was like, well, let me tell you how this is going to work. I'm going to buy 17.
Yeah.
When I get to my 17 location, if there's 10 more, then I'll do those. And, it was very fortunate that Dr. Newcomb, I was an employee for a long time. Yeah. He was very kind. And he says, all right, I'll do that deal for you. And so took a little negotiating, but sure enough, I had to buy the rights for 17 or 16 more locations. I was fortunate. I had some good friends who were trying to get their own franchise to be in the business. And I told them, I said, look, if you come over and help me own this business, start this business, give you sweat equity in it, let's build this thing out. Yeah. Well, we were all, I was 23, just turned 24 by the time we opened the first location. Not married, was young, 10 feet tall and bulletproof. And so we opened the first location and we ran hard, and then met a banker who was saying, hey, we can see the success that you're having. I said, great. Can I get a $500,000 line of credit? I want to build 2 more locations. And sure enough, less than 18 months later, I was under construction with 2 more locations, both in Forest Acres, which was in Columbia, and then Greenville, South Carolina. So, but the good part about it, I had some young guys that were with me who I was like, all right, Chris, you move to Greenville. I got Ayers and Troy and Scott down here. I said, this is how we're going to build it out. And sure enough, we built it out really through cash flow. And so I just kept reinvesting it. All I needed to do was eat and sleep. So, and it was pretty easy when you're at the restaurant all the time.
Yeah.
And so,
well, when you do nothing but work, right?
Right.
It was, you don't have a family, and you're not, going out and trying to impress girls and all that kind of stuff. You're just head down, getting after it,
grinding. Yes. And so roughly in, less than 10 years, we built 16 locations. And it was so much fun. We got involved in another franchise. It was a franchise down in New Orleans. Tom Kajimi had reached out to me. He was the CEO of Ruth Chris Steakhouse at the time. He bought this small franchise called Italian Pie. And I was actually looking at Mellow Mushroom at the time. And Mellow Mushroom's average units were half of what Italian Pies were. And Italian Pies were more than half of what I was doing per week in a McAlister's. But I love food, and being from Laurel, so close to New Orleans, it's great food. And so I took, I'll never forget, I took Chris and Scott down to look at Italian Pie, and we loved the food, but their volume wasn't impressive. They were doing about 14,500 a week in sales. So I said, look, Tom, if we're going to open a first location, can I just change your throughput a little bit? I said, I grew up in manufacturing. I always listened to my dad about, kind of the old, the assembly line process. How do we put the throughput? How do you move the widgets is really what it is. And so Tom was nice enough. He said, all right, you develop the prototype, keep our brand, got to be our signage, got to be all. I said, no problem. I said, I just want to tweak your kitchen. Yeah. And sure enough, we opened up our first location in 2003, and we were doing 35 a week. So all the franchisees are looking at us going, what are y'all doing differently? I'm like, we're just making food, the same quality, high quality food, just faster. We're just turning the customers. So
Awesome.
that's really what it was all about. And so we opened 3 of those locations. And then we were running out of territory in South Carolina in 2006. I wanted to buy Virginia because Virginia had not been sold yet.
Mhm.
McAlisters came to me and said, look, for you to get Virginia, you need to sell your Italian pies, which I did. And in 2006, my dad literally would send letters to me and my brother. This is even though email existed, he still hand wrote letters. And once you could try to decipher his handwriting, because it was terrible,
Yeah.
he's pretty much telling
Mine
my
too.
brother. Yeah. I mean, he was telling my brother and me that the world was coming to an end. So we better shore up our balance sheets and try to figure out how we're going to survive the storm. He was a year and a half early. He said it would happen in February 2007. 2007 came along. We were still doing extremely well, had double-digit sales. And then the group out of Charlotte, the franchisees, kind of wanted to buy me. I was young. I was 32 at the time. So I was like, well, I got I had 2 infant children, was living in Columbia. They, tried to buy all of it, couldn't. And then I'll never forget, I was sitting on the beach in Myrtle Beach with my wife. We were looking at all the cranes that were building all the condos.
Mhm.
2007, I looked at my wife and I said, you know what? I think my dad's right. I think this world is nuts. I think we're about to have something bad happen. So I called them up. I said, you still want to do it? And they were like, yeah, but we can't buy all of you. We just bought Denver and parts of Wyoming. But we can buy 9 of, your 16 locations. So sure enough, they'd already bought 1 of them in Rock Hill. So I kept 5 of them. I was building 6. I sold 9 to them. So in 2007, I came home one day and I said to my wife, I said, we're moving to Charleston, South Carolina. I said, I'm going to keep 6 on the coast, sell the other 9 to them. Rourke Capital had just come in and bought McAlister's about a year and a half before then. They wanted me to remodel a lot of locations for what I built them for. And I said, well, you got to show me a return on investment if I'm going to go and spend all this money, re-imaging these locations. And they at that time.
Got to make sense.
Yeah. And so I took the deal, I kept 6 on the coast. And then 6 months later, another group came in and said, hey, I hear, you're selling your restaurants. I said, no, I was going to keep 6 and try to figure out what's going to happen with the economy. This is in February of 2008. It was shaky at the time.
Yeah.
And they ended up, the guy came in and bought my last 6. And there I was, I guess at that time I was 34, 2 very young children, unemployed. And so, I thought, my wife told me to take a year off and let's just travel across the United States. We owned a bus at that time. We were going to put our 2 infant children on it and just drive across the United States. And I couldn't sit still. Still wanted to do something, but really that happened in November of 2008. And if everybody remembers March, I think it was March 6, 2009, when it hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
So I partnered up with a friend of mine. We spent a lot of time helping people kind of survive the storm, a very bad economy, helping them write their balance sheets, negotiate with banks, kind of got in the so-called private equity world while I was trying to find what I was going to do next. Yeah. So even in 2009 and 2010, I was still looking at all different franchises. Looked hard at Nukes. Chris Nuke, after he sold McAlister's, started Nukes. Was very successful, and I just I wanted to kind of find what I wanted to do next. So crazy enough, I started in 2011. I started a company called Bottles. It's called Bottles Beverage Superstore. It's a 16,000 square foot competitor of Total Wine. The reason why I started it,
We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.